Good morning, everyone. My name is Cheryl Kleeman, and I'm the Director for Transfer and Student Veteran Success here at Oklahoma State University. I had the pleasure of working with an amazing planning committee this year, and if everyone in the planning committee that's in the room could please stand. This conference could not have happened without so many different institutions and so many different people coming together to make this happen, and it is my pleasure to thank the planning committee and to thank all of you for being here today. Before we get started, I do have a couple housekeeping items. Restrooms are going to be located down the hall past the restrooms. If you walk all the way down to the right, that's where the restrooms will be. And you will be passing the case study rooms where our breakout sessions are going to be as well. If you would like to log in over Wi-Fi, you can see that there is Wi-Fi information on your tables as well as up on the screen here in just a second, and there will be information on this in each of the breakout rooms as well. I also wanted to quickly go over what the day will look like. We'll have our opening with our keynote, Shannon Looney, followed by our students leaving for their leadership activities, and then the Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education will deliver their presentation on the state of transfer in Oklahoma. We'll go into our first breakout sessions, and then we'll come back for lunch, then go back out for our third breakout session. Unfortunately, one of our guest speakers, Dr. Nancy Sanchez, could not be here today, and she was scheduled for breakout session 3, session C. She had a family emergency, and she does send her apologies. She said she would look into getting a Zoom recording that I can share at a later date. Following that, we will move into the collaborative sessions, and then we'll all come back for the transfer student panel. Without further ado, please allow me to welcome Dr. Chris Francisco. Dr. Francisco is the Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education and a Professor of Mathematics here at Oklahoma State University.
Thank you, Cheryl, and good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's a pleasure to see all of you here today. It feels like we ordered up a couple days of winter for you to come to campus today. I thought summer was never going to end, and now we get winter and then back to summer and then probably an ice storm or something later in this fall. But it's great to see you all on campus, and we're really happy to be able to host this face-to-face. It's great to see everyone here. I want to thank Cheryl Kleeman and Vince Rivera and Lauren Bundy in our Office of Transfer and Veteran Student Success for all the work they've done locally to make this happen, and to thank everybody on the statewide planning committee as well. I know how much time and effort you spent in setting up this conference and figuring out what sessions would be most valuable to everybody and to allow us to collaborate and talk about issues facing transfer students. Really appreciate all of your effort there. Also want to thank the staff of the State Regents for coming here today and for their support of this conference. I think you all have done a tremendous job in trying to coordinate our institutions across the state and try to make things as smooth as possible for our students, and we really appreciate that collaboration we've had with you. We're also extremely excited to have a group of transfer students with us today at this conference. That's why we're here, after all, and so really pleased to be able to have them and thank them for taking a day away from their studies to be with us on campus. They'll be doing some leadership activities with our Hargis Leadership Institute on campus, and excited to be able to have them share in that experience, and then to talk with us this afternoon on the student panel so that we can hear directly from them and find out what their experiences have been like and how we can go about serving them better. I think there are a lot of things that we've done well as a state in the transfer arena, and I know the course equivalency project here is much more robust than it is in a lot of other places, and very pleased that we've been able to make that work. We've been talking a lot as a state about how we can improve it even more and how we can make things even easier for students as they move from one institution to another, particularly in areas like general education, when students take a general education course at one institution and trying to make sure they don't have to repeat that at another institution. That's certainly something that's really on everybody's radar. But I think we have a lot of opportunities to learn from each other, and one of the things I like so much about an event like this is that we're able to talk to each other about what's working well and what challenges we have, and talk to each other face to face about how we can deal with some of those. I think there's been a lot of discussion in the last several decades about the first year experience, and that's great and that's very helpful because everybody who's in college starts out as a freshman. but we'd like to get the transfer discussion to that level as well so that we all have really good ideas about best practices and can figure out what works well for us on a local level. So thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate your coming and your devotion to transfer students. Thank you especially to the students for being here to help educate us and let us learn from you, and hope you enjoy your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Francisco. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Shannon Looney. Shannon is an amazing individual. I've had the pleasure of working with her on a variety of different projects, and I'm so excited for you guys to hear from her today. She has spent the last several years consulting in various capacities with organizations like AskU, the APLU, the Ascendium Foundation, among others. And much of her work is centered around transfer and transfer initiatives. Shannon has truly been one of the driving forces behind transfer that's been happening nationwide. And I'm looking forward to her sharing her experience and her knowledge with us. Shannon, the floor is yours.
Okay, I don't like standing statically, so I'm gonna go rogue. Is it okay if I? Okay. Thank you for that, Cheryl, and good morning, everyone. This is my first time in Oklahoma, so I'm super pumped to be here, and I'm super excited and grateful that all of you are here today, and hopefully you'll take a thing or two away from this presentation that I have. And so, as Cheryl mentioned, I'm gonna actually present to you a little bit today, but it really, more importantly, get you in conversation with each other about the transfer experience and how we can make transfer as a practice and experience in the state of Oklahoma more equitable. So we're gonna reimagine transfer by centering on equity this morning. But before I dive into my remarks, I want you guys to imagine we're in the year 2045, we're in the future. And every single student in Oklahoma transfers. That's just the common practice, it's the norm. So I want you to think about, what did you guys do at your institutions? How did you change in order for Oklahoma to become that national model that every student transfers? That's, again, it's easy, it's seamless, it's more equitable. This is the norm. So I want you to either jot down or think of one idea in your mind of how your institutions had to change in order to reach this kind of 2045 state in which transfer is the norm. So as you're kind of thinking through that, so my objectives for this morning's conversation are threefold. First, we're gonna spend some time reflecting on the transfer student experience, and I've got some national data to pull into the conversation to really get us thinking about what do we know about the transfer experience at the national level, and how does that compare to what you know at your own respective institutions. And for students, your experiences also matter in this too. And then we're going to spend some time really digging into how does equity show up in our transfer practice, and how do we need to actually get more explicit and focused on centering on equity, and really thinking about how are there certain institutional barriers that create the inequities that we're observing right now in the transfer experience. And then we're going to revisit our question, and we're going to think about how can we reimagine what transfer looks like in the year 2045 and beyond. So with that, I want to start by kicking off and reflecting on this question: what do we know about the transfer student experience? And if we look at the national data, this is through the National Student Clearinghouse, we know that 80% of community college students indicate interest in transferring. That's pretty significant. But we also know only 31% are successful at transferring to a four-year institution, and of that, only 15% are successful in getting a credential. That's not a great number of outcomes, right? So the vast majority have an interest, but such a smaller percentage are actually successful. What we also know is that the pandemic did a real number on all of our systems, and transfer was definitely part of that. So we know that close to 300,000 transfer enrollments dropped as a product of the pandemic. And we know that there were pretty significant differences based on institution type. For two-year institutions, there was about a 21% decrease or decline in lateral transfers, and 18% decline in reverse. And for four-year institutions, there was a 10% decline in upward transfer and an 8% decline in lateral. I feel like I'm just like showing you the doom and gloom, the apocalypse is now, no. But if we revisit this question, what do we know about the transfer student experience? Well, it's not that great, right? it yields a lot of low success when we look at those numbers, and we can easily infer that it's really challenging. So when I've done this presentation before, I always like to bring in a comparison of something that like we all can universally agree in this room is a really challenging experience, but it actually has a higher success rate than transfer. Climbing Mount Everest has a higher success rate than transferring to a 4-year institution and getting a degree. 33% of people who attempt to climb actually get to the top and get down. I mean, this is insane. This is it's up to 30,000 feet, right? This is one of the world's tallest peaks. Now, I want to honor that the pool of climbers is very different than the pool of transfer students, right? Like, we're talking about comparing older white men with money to people in the transfer system, and that's not who's being served. But my comparison is simply this. Transfer feels like climbing Mount Everest. And there are very specific experiences that we can actually see the comparison across the two, and I'm going to offer some up here this morning. The first one being, when climbing Mount Everest, you have to anticipate there's going to be some external events or threats that will prevent you from being successful, from getting to the top and getting back down. It could be a snowstorm that just comes in, a squall, right? Or it could be an avalanche. So we know that there are these real palpable environmental threats that can delay or derail, if not altogether stop, a climber from getting to the top. I would argue with transfer, there are similar external events or environmental circumstances that prevent students from being able to transfer. It could be their car breaking down so that they can't get to and from campus, or they have to repurpose some money that they otherwise would use for school to fix the car. It could be having to take care of kids if childcare falls through, or a loved one who falls ill, and you have to, again, compete with your time and reallocate and reprioritize based on life's needs. And so we know that in our transfer practice, we really have to understand, and to the extent that we can, help intervene and provide support for those unpredictable environmental forces. We also know that to climb Mount Everest, it's really best attempted when you have that high-touch guided support in the form of a Sherpa. So Sherpas are individuals from Nepal. They understand how the technical pieces of climbing. They can help climbers navigate which path to go up when. If there's an unpredicted environmental force like an avalanche, they know hopefully how to dig someone out. But these are also individuals who possess extreme localized expertise on the landscape, the Himalayas, because they're from there. I would argue we have some transfer Sherpas in the room, if not in the room, on your campus. These are individuals who have that extreme localized expertise and knowledge of the transfer process with partner institutions, who can help navigate and guide students on which courses to take when, what forms to fill out when. They also understand the landscape of your home institutions, being able to field questions and needs related to resources that are not transfer related. So we know that those relationships, and I also want to honor, it may not be staff, it could be a peer, it could be a faculty member. So we know that these transfer champions and transfer Sherpas are really important for helping to facilitate more of a guided, high-touch experience in navigating transfer. We also know that in order to climb Mount Everest, you really have to rely on a set of tools and resources. So when you climb higher, you lose oxygen. Many, if not all, climbers have to use oxygen tanks after a certain elevation. That's not used the whole time. But we also know they use ropes when it's particularly steep, pickaxes when it's icy. I would argue, even though transfer students don't use pickaxes, there are some tools and resources that are really helpful for transfer students to use. It could be a transfer scholarship to help round out costs if there are some lingering outstanding fees. It could be a degree map, so that they're able to see which courses to take and when and feel empowered as kind of agents and owners of their own transfer journey. And so we know that there are really specific tools and resources that are super important for students to have access to as they're navigating the transfer pathway. And then last but not least, and I can't speak to, I've never personally climbed Mount Everest, but I've read enough to know it's physically taxing, right? And so can transfer. Transfer can feel emotionally and physically taxing. We have a lot of barriers within our transfer pathways that can create very frustrating experiences that can leave students feeling defeated. And I know personally, when I feel frustrated, I shut down. Stress physically manifests. And so we have to be cognizant and aware of how transfer practice needs to take care of the whole student on their wellness in this process. So I'm actually going to now put you in conversation at your tables for about 5 minutes. I want you to talk to each other, because these are just a few ways that we understand transfer to feel like climbing Mount Everest. But I want you to discuss, how else may that transfer experience feel? So I'll give you 5 minutes and then I'll round us back up. All right, we're going to have you wrap up your comments at your table, but I would love to hear from people who would like to share with your colleagues in the room. How else may the transfer experience feel? And I'm going to float with a mic, and I may plop it in front of you, unless someone, a brave soul, would like to share. Excellent.
Hi there. My name is Laura Latta. I'm with the Tulsa Higher Education Consortium. And one thing we were talking about is the difference in experiences of transfer students who are traditional students in the 18 to 24 age range and adult learners who are above the age of 25, and how supporting those students requires different sets of engagement strategies. We talked about mentorships, how that may be a really, really great fit for the traditional student, but maybe a little more complicated for those adult learners who have kids and families and lives and jobs. So thinking about how to diversify those supports.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought in the nuance. Not all transfer students are the same, right? All right, how about one other comment? No one. Oh, thank you.
So one of the things that we considered is that when students transfer, depending on the transfer student, they may not necessarily know what all the rules and regulations are at that particular institution. So the transferring or having some type of transfer orientation specific to students transferring may help them to, one, to see the culture, but to also see what to do once they're there. Because, if you're going from one university to another, you're like, okay, I know the general stuff, but where do I do this where, and where do I check in, and where do I start? But then if you're like coming from Tulsa Community College and going to to a 4-year, you're like, okay, this is a little different. There's a whole lot going on here. Where do I go, and who do I see? And so some type of orientation would help facilitate that.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, establishing that sense of familiarity and connection is really important. All right, I want one more comment. All right. Are you sure? We could do both. We'll do both.
So one of the things we talked about is, the social aspect of transferring. And so we know it's really good to have orientations and all this stuff, but realistically, we're all humans and we have social needs. And so one of the big things is taking that into account and recognizing that people are coming from out of state, out of country in some cases, and they don't have friends. And so when you go to class, sure, you meet people in class, but realistically, it's like when you go to work. You go to work and you leave and you don't really want to hang out with people outside of work. And so, and that's perfectly cool, but just making sure that there's programs or clubs or whatever on any given institution so that people can connect. And for those who want to interact and make friends, so that's available. So,
yeah, excellent. Thank you, Tremonte.
I know I just mentioned over here that for us at OU, what I always hear from students is they're not prepared for the academic rigor, especially those who are doing an upward transfer and even lateral transfers, because we're in R1. The academic preparedness when they come on, they may be really super successful where they're at, but that first 6 weeks, they get their first round of tests, and they're not prepared for the newer reality that they're at. And so that can cause a lot of strife for them, make them second guess their decision to come.
Yeah. And not to jump too far into our barrier discussion, that's where the flag should be raised on how are faculty discussing kind of shared preparedness around the curriculum and what's happening in the classroom as they transition. So thank you both for your points. What I love about this conversation, I just started hearing some nuances around the types of transfer students, those from out of state, those who are older, and how that can affect their experiences. Because when I say transfer student, I don't mean this monolith, right? Transfer students are not the same. And we've been talking very generally about how, generally the transfer student experience feels. But this climb on Mount Everest is not the same for every student, because transfer is an equity issue, which is why we're also all here today, right? And so I now want you just to privately reflect. I'm going to give you about a minute and a half. I want you to reflect on this question. How is equity reflected in your transfer work? So I was very intentional that I asked this question before even defining a very key word in this question, which is equity, right? And the not problem, but the opportunity, but also what makes this work challenging is that we don't have a singular definition for equity, at least not in the field of higher ed, right? I can't pop up something here and say, like, this is what the field endorses. This is what we all understand equity to be. If you do not have conversations with your partner institutions right now around how you both are observing equity in the transfer pathway, I highly, highly recommend and advise that you start doing that, of talking with counterparts at your partner institutions about what is equity? How are you observing it in the work that you're doing? But again, what we know is what challenges us in this space is we don't have a singular definition. To that end, we do know that it's not equality. And this is something that gets very interchanged. And I'm gonna be a little tongue-in-cheek here with this cartoon that many of you probably have seen before, but as you can see here, this cartoon is a lineup of critters in which they all have the same equal, fair selection exam. They have to climb to the top of the tree. Now, in looking at this lineup, you know that only one of them is gonna be successful, so the outcomes are really inequitable. But it's because the design of it, the input, is really inequitable. It may be equal that they all have to climb, but not all of them can. So it's not about equality, because if you think about this lineup, it's about power. It's about who's included in the design of our programs, whose needs are excluded from the practices and the programs that we're doing. And the back table, you actually teed this up beautifully about age, of acknowledging, transfer students as parents have different needs. It may not benefit them. So the practices we have in place may actually be unintentionally excluding groups, right? So it is about this understanding or recognition of who's included, who's excluded in our transfer practice and programs. And it's because it's really also informed by not only individually how we experience the world and life, but it's also how collectively we do, and how our institutions and our histories, what we inherit, informs our experiences around equity. Now, I know I said that there's no definition for equity, but I wanted to share with you one here. So as part of the work that I've been doing on a national level, I've been working, as Cheryl mentioned, with some associations, but also working with NACADA, Achieving the Dream, EDUCAUSE, like groups that are very invested in this space of thinking about how to improve transfer pathways, but then also advising. We all created a definition a year ago. And this is our definition. This is all part of something called the Advising Success Network that we're part of. But I wanted to share it here because it may be helpful. And so this is the point of view that I always kind of operate against when I'm giving presentations or talks related to equity. And I want to start with simply what's in red. We believe that equity is a capacity. It's a capacity of individuals, but it's also a capacity of your institutions. Much like your institution has the capacity to use data, to pull data, disaggregating it is an equity capacity. So we believe that equity is observed as a capacity. We believe that it really requires us to take a more justice orientation to it, that all of the work that we're trying to do is to organize ourselves structurally more so that we're achieving more just outcomes, that we're trying to achieve a state of doing no harm. It requires us as educators and practitioners and leaders to really recognize how our systems historically did exclude groups, how it did actually lead to harm, and that it's our job to rectify that, to reimagine that. And so we believe this because higher education was not designed to be equitable. It was actually designed to be exclusive. And so I took the liberty of collecting all of Oklahoma's institutions on this timeline here. These were the years of every Oklahoma institution when it was established. And to kind of underscore, and again, it's divided principally by 2-year and 4-year institutions, but to underscore or explore this idea or concept that higher education was not designed to be equitable, let's overlay some national events on this. I'm going to start with 2 ones that actually predate Oklahoma's first institution. So starting with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, this is where Andrew Jackson, president at the time, created Trail of Tears, essentially. It was a systemic removal and genocide of indigenous groups from the East Coast, displacing them further west to territories like Oklahoma. And then with the end of the Civil War in 1865, that may have abolished slavery, but it didn't abolish admission standards, right? So the universities and colleges we had open at that time and subsequent did not admit newly freed, formerly enslaved black residents. But this is where the birth of historically black colleges come into play, and Langston University in Oklahoma is one of those institutions that sought to correct for that. And then, unique to Oklahoma was the Red River War of 1874, and what that was the final kind of battle between indigenous groups and the US government that created the reservation system in the state. So it actually purposely gave a portion of land to indigenous groups that could not access some of the institutions that were later developed. And then the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, which decimated Black Wall Street and basically bottomed out any economic opportunity for black residents to have access to some of the other institutions or systems in the state. And then fast forward to the GI Bill, what did that do? It gave more funding for veterans to have access to our education system, but this is where you see a lot of blossoming in the community college space. And then with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that may have desegregated our systems, but we know that that form of desegregation, excuse me, I need water. We know that segregation, thank you, Todd, just took on new forms, mainly in the form of like redlining that we see today. So my point with this, to drive or underscore this concept home a little further, is the vast majority of institutions in Oklahoma and in this country were established during a sustained time frame of over a century's worth of institutionalized racism and classism. We've inherited a lot of practices and a lot of ways of doing that have evolved, but that were still designed to preserve that sense of exclusion. And transfer happened in that time frame in 1901 outside of Chicago. This was between Rainey College and University of Chicago, a very private, or not private, but an elite four-year. So sorry, gang. On that note, transfer was not designed to be equitable. It was designed to be exclusive. And we see how those exclusionary patterns are playing out today. There are differences across race and ethnicity in the number of students who are successful in transfer. The most noted ones between Black and Latinx students don't complete at as high of rates as white or Asian. I also want to honor, this is a very simplified disaggregation, but it is important to note that there are racial differences. We also know that it's an equity issue for other types of student groups based on your location. Rural learners don't graduate or transfer at the same rates. Also, low-income learners, veterans, students with children, or any kind of dependent. I also want to recognize that these groups are also extremely interrelated. You could have a Black veteran with kids, a low-income white learner in a rural location, right? So it requires us to really think about how are these all interconnected and how are our transfer systems not accommodating them. So I now want you to privately reflect, how does history relate to inequities in the transfer experience? I'm going to give you just another minute while I get water. So the reason why it's important to kind of think about the historical context is it does factor into some of the practices that we have ongoing today that are leading to some of the inequities we're observing in the student experience. And so I want to now kind of transition us into a more focused conversation on what I call equity-related barriers. Before that, though, I want to just do some light level setting. What do I mean by a barrier? So this is something that's institutionally driven. It's institutional level. It's in the structure, it's in the design of the organization or the practice. And there are some pretty significant examples on a national level that I'm going to raise up here that we know drive inequities as experienced by transfer students and, frankly, students generally. The first one being transcript withholding. This should not be a shocking one. But if a student has an outstanding balance or an unpaid fee, their transcript doesn't travel with them. They don't own it. And so who does that harm? It harms low-income learners largely, right? Students who can't pay for the transcript to go. And so we know that this is a widespread practice nationally that frankly needs to stop. Another, GPA requirements. So there's some great research out of Georgetown and the UC system that's actually showing GPA rates are really only correlated with the available time to study. Doesn't necessarily denote that there's been a command of the content. So if you think about that availability of time to study, who does this harm? It harms students who are working. It harms students who have other responsibilities outside of their academics that they probably have to prioritize. When working in college, you have that competition for your time, your energy, other resources. And so we know that GPA requirements, whether it's from institution to institution or to the program, can actually be really harmful for some students. And so that's why it's important to kind of think about multiple measures or multiple ways that you're admitting students. Another sense of what can lead to a sense of exclusion on campus or experience, bias and deficit mindset. I'm going to give you an example on this because I think we all know it, but I experienced a year ago, I worked with a 4-year university that had high drop failure withdrawal rates in their chemistry department. And when we disaggregated the data, transfer students had the highest DFW rate in general chemistry. I asked the faculty department chair, I said, well, why do you think that that's the case? His response was, it's because they're trying to game the system. They just think they'll take the easy courses at the community college, and they're not ready. They're not ready for our institution, of which I said, no. I was like, transfer students aren't scheming in the corner trying to game. I was like, are you talking to your faculty at the other institution? And he said, no. So the barrier was actually, and what led, he was letting his bias on who was transitioning into his course override his ability to support them, his ability to actually start conversing or working with his partner institution to talk about how are you defining or sharing rigor in the classroom. And then last but certainly not least that I want to offer up here is this sense of lack of connection and peers. And so that's why like orientations are really effective in creating some social connection. The social element, absolutely paramount and important. But if students transfer in with no one to identify with, especially if you're a student going to a much bigger institution, especially if you're BIPOC, low income, and you're going into an institution that is more white, higher income, like these are some of the big areas that we're seeing inequities arise, understandably, because it's limiting that sense of connection and belonging. So, I want you, again, at your tables, and we'll give you about 5 minutes, to talk about what other barriers create or contribute to that sense of exclusion that transfer students can feel on campus. And in your discussions, I want you to specifically think about some of those subgroups and also how students can hold more than one identity. What are the ways that you know your campuses are excluding these groups? How are you not serving their needs? All right, we'll give you 5 minutes. All right. So I said 5 minutes, but it was really 3 because we're running behind. For that, I apologize, because it also sounds like this is a good problem to have. I always enjoy it when I have to cut into conversation. That means hopefully you were talking about the question. So I'm going to open it up again just for a few comments. Does anyone want to share what you discussed? What other barriers were you able to identify at your tables? Yeah. Oh.
One of my personal barriers that I don't see up there is students with disabilities. So I don't see anything up there about that, but there's been quite a bit of challenges with that. And I'm also non-traditional, so I'm older. So, and I also have a child, so it's a lot. And I noticed when I was looking at the scholarships available, most of them were for high school students or recently graduate students, and I didn't really see anything for me personally. So that's something that I noticed.
Thank you for sharing your lived experience right now with this, because you're right, like the way we structure scholarship opportunities don't always account for other needs. And you are absolutely right, students with disabilities is also a group that we need to consider in our transfer work.
So speaking of scholarships, I work at UCO. We have scholarships for transfer students, but to maintain that scholarship, you have to be enrolled in at least 12 hours. So maintaining full-time enrollment is not always easy for our transfer students.
Yep, absolutely. The conditions we set can actually be really problematic. All right, move up to the front.
All right, I'm from UCO as well, and one of my experiences is that we have a lack of online courses, and I know for students in like those rural settings, or even like one of the things we talked about were students maybe in like South OKC that can't commute to Edmond. Like it's easier if they have those online classes that they can take, but we don't have a lot of those.
Yep. Thinking about the modality. All right, we'll take one more, and then Cheryl, I promise to wrap up.
Yeah, we talked a lot about one of the barriers is just knowledge, and not just student knowledge, but also advisor knowledge, which is why this conference is great. But knowing, and we talked about students with disabilities as well. If a student with a disability says, "How do I transfer my accommodations from TCC to NSU?" It would be talk to NSU. We're not sure. And if we had that knowledge and could share that with students and other advisors, it would make that transition a much easier process.
Yeah, data sharing is huge. It's infuriating to think about when students do transfer to another institution, they show up like a white screen, right? Like there's not a lot of information in terms of what your institution's inheriting. All right, I now just kind of want to wrap this again. Remember, we started our conversation thinking about the state of Oklahoma in the year 2045, figured it out, everyone transfers. I want you to think about that idea that you had or that note that you wrote. Does that how did your institution change? Did this conversation make you think a little differently around what it is you would change? So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, but thank you so much for letting me come crash the symposium conference. Thank you.